Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Yule. I'm one of the reference librarians at the Minnesota State Law Library, and I'm pleased to introduce Judith Rush, who is the outreach manager for Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers, and who will be speaking today about how we can reduce stigma to avoid burnout. Many of you may know Judith from her time at the University of St. Thomas, where she directed the Mentor Externship Program, and from her work as a private practice attorney. Judith joined Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers in 2022, where she manages outreach efforts. I'll let Judith say more about her current work and anything else to introduce yourself more fully. But I want to extend a big thank you for agreeing to do this talk. I know it's going to be really helpful for people. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Scott. And thank you, all 167 of you, for being here today. So I'll just tell you a little bit about what brings me here. As a young lawyer, I discovered early on this concept of quality of life and balance is what we called it back in the day. And then I started doing things like I joined the Life and Law Committee of the State Bar and got involved, was introduced to the idea that there were lawyer assistance programs out there around the country. And I realized how important it was for lawyers to be healthy, especially as it related to being ethical, to being their authentic selves, but also to being ethical lawyers. And so I spent my career at the intersection of well-being and lawyer assistance and ethics. I was a volunteer for the ethics system here in Minnesota, and teaching, and I practiced, as Scott said, I'm still a practicing lawyer now, but I jumped in and started volunteering at LCL all those years ago. And one of the things I did, as most people do when their eyes are open to something that they think is important, I would write articles and sound the alarm about well-being, talking about balance, talking about burnout. And I come before you today to tell you that knowledge is indeed power, but knowledge isn't enough. So having an awareness of these things is great, but if we don't put into practice, either because we don't know what we can do, or we don't put into practice, things that can help us because we are spending our time mainly helping other people, it doesn't help us very much. And so this program, I hope to bring to you some definitely some learning opportunities, but also some super practical things that you can do to actually address burnout. Before we start, I'm going to have you do a quick exercise, and I did this before because I'm going to lead you now. But I feel whenever you transition, especially as lawyers and legal professionals, we're so focused on what we're doing, and then we see on our calendar we have something else, and we move to it. And I want to just take a quick couple of minutes to help you transition from what you were doing before and what you'll do at the end of this program. And it's a breathing exercise, super quick. I'm going to tell you first what it is I'm going to have you do, and then you'll do it. It only has 4 steps, and one of those is actually resting. And so I'm going to ask you to don't do it now, but I ask you to breathe in and hold to a count of 5, and I'll do the counting. Exhale for 5, and then pause. So inhale, hold, exhale, and pause, all for a count of 5. So let's get started. Close your eyes if you like. Obviously, I don't know whether you're doing this or not, but I'd encourage you to do it. Just give it a try. So breathe in for the count of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hold your breath for a count of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now exhale for a count of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then pause. And optimally, this is something that you do 3 times in succession, and doing it 3 times a day has been proven to improve heart rate, blood pressure, and overall good health. It's also one of the tools that you can use to avoid chronic stress and burnout. So what are we going to do today? So we're going to talk about what burnout is, how it develops. We're going to talk about the role that bias and stigma play both in driving burnout and in discouraging us from asking for help. And then how we can counter bias and stigma and help ourselves and others. So what is burnout? I start with a definition from the World Health Organization that tells us that it's a workplace phenomenon. It's not an illness, it's a syndrome. And it results from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And if I were to write the definition, I would say effectively, because I think lawyers and legal professionals, we're always trying to be successful at everything we do. And what we're trying to do here is to give us some things that we can effectively manage stress, but the last thing we need is to feel like we need to succeed at it. And so essentially it's pervasive exhaustion and two key characteristics, one of which is the impact that it has on your work. And that impact is a detachment or a feeling of a separation from the work, cynicism, and we'll talk in more detail about each of these factors, but then the impact that it has on you. So it impacts your belief in yourself, in your ability, loss of confidence, and it's definitely, it's a workplace phenomenon, but it is definitely impacted by things on the outside. So stress is the building block of burnout. A stressor is anything you can, as it says, see, hear, smell, taste, or imagine could do you harm. So it's a perception by your brain that you are under threat in some way. And some people might say that's, something that's causing you to go into that state isn't a real stressor. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's whether it's how your brain processes that. And what happens is, when you're under threat, the stress response occurs. And so everything shifts. Your body, your brain and your body shift so that you can rise up to the challenge. And we can't eliminate from our work environment stress, and we don't want to, because there is positive stress called U stress, not U stress, but EU stress, that actually allows us to rise to the challenge and do the things we need to do, whether it's to put on the brakes in the car if a ball rolls across the road, or whether it's to get that brief done. That adrenaline that kicks in will help us over the finish line. And so stress can be bad or good, but we'll talk a lot about what it means to continue to have chronic stress. Is lawyer stress different? Well, we're different. The work that we do as legal professionals, we're held to a high standard by those rules of professional conduct, but we hold ourselves frequently to a perfection standard, which is pretty hard to meet. We fear failure. We learn early on that perfection, getting it right, is rewarded, and making a mistake needs to be avoided at all costs. It definitely impacts how we approach the world. Pessimism makes us very good lawyers. It allows us to see the breach before it happens. It allows us to see the consequences, imagine all of the things that we need to guard against as lawyers. It makes us great law students as well. But the challenge is that pessimism can impact our overall worldview. And so we might begin to think that negative outcomes are permanent, unchangeable, and just they're going to happen. Isolation and uncertainty, the Harvard Business Review article from a number of years ago, which is on the sources and resources in the packet that you'll receive, tells us that we are the loneliest profession. And we might be isolated because we're working at home, and as most of us were during the pandemic, some of us still are. But we can also be isolated because we don't feel a sense of belonging or can't be ourselves at work. And uncertainty, we don't like uncertainty. We like to know the answers. We believe we need to know all the answers when in fact we can't possibly know all the answers all the time. But that's kind of what we, the sort of the robe we wear as lawyers. Vicarious trauma. There was a recent study that showed that 80% of law students have been impacted by trauma, have been traumatized, and you know, we know that law school itself can be traumatizing, but definitely the work we do as lawyers and legal professionals, we're working on other people's trauma, vicarious trauma, and it definitely impacts us. So what happens with that stress response? Your brain says there's a threat. Your body goes into full stress response. Your heart beats faster. You know, your pain is diminished. All of these things that allow you to not feel the pain, to be able to deal with the threat until the threat is gone. And then as a result, there's other things that are being deprioritized. Digestion slows, immune functioning shifts, and adrenaline and cortisol is running through your body to help you deal with the stress. And in the short term, that's awesome. As I said, it allows us to avoid discomfort and deal with the threat. Long term, it impacts our health in an incredibly negative way. The authors of the Burnout book that I referenced in that reference source guide, which is a significant source of the information in the CLE, the authors liken it to a fire hose. You know, this those hormones rushing through our system and becoming chronic can be like a fire hose in our blood vessels, weakening them, causing heart problems, impacting all of our organs. And so burnout happens when chronic stress leads to burnout, and it happens when the demands of the job outstrip the person's ability to cope with the stress. And what does that mean? So, first of all, I provide a reference point. Christina Maslach is a foremost researcher of burnout, focusing on the helping profession. She's provided the models that we continue to use today, and that you'll see in the. I'm going to pull up a slide that talks about the drivers. That's her work. So these drivers of burnout outstrip a person's ability to deal with the resulting chronic stress. And the next piece of this is that, and I provide Nagoski. Nagoski, Emily and Amelia Nagoski have contributed scientifically and sometimes humorously in the book that they wrote on how to address and avoid burnout. And what's key is that your body needs some cue that you are no longer under threat. And so when our body doesn't get that, and we ignore the stressors that we're under, and we suppress our stress response, we end up with chronically activated stress, which leads to burnout. So Maslach's definition, just to give a little bit more detail, is so that we have that excessive stress, caring too much for too long. We have that detachment that it's called depersonalization, but we're detached. Our empathy and our caring for others is depleted, which is troublesome in a profession that serves others. And then that third element, how it impacts us, we having a sense of futility, like nothing makes a difference. There's nothing that we can do to either get ourselves out of this or to return to to what we were before we started to experience these symptoms of burnout. So what drives burnout? This is as I said, Maslach's test, and generally when it's applied across the board to all of the serving professions, we look at these factors. And so workload, we don't need to meet all of these factors, so this is not a six-factor test. Instead, where there's a high frequency of any one of these, and it's not effectively managed, that the stress isn't dealt with, it can result in burnout. And so workload, less people, more work, not having sufficient control over the work being done, not feeling any reward from what it is you're doing, Community, there we're talking about, insufficient positive interactions with others. We know that positive interactions actually help avoid burnout, help avoid stress. Negative or insufficient human interaction has the opposite effect. Where there's fairness again, we're talking about work environment, where there's unfairness in the work environment, whether that's glass ceilings or cliffs, nepotism, favoritism, any of the isms, explicit or implicit bias, microaggressions, which Professor T. Anansi Wilson says traumatize on the spot, yet are so common in the workplace and elsewhere, definitely impact and drive burnout. And then finally, values. The reality of what we're doing may not connect to our values, or perhaps with us as lawyers, what brought us here to the profession. When we look at that same list as applied specifically to lawyers, and I'd say lawyers and legal professionals, lawyers can be pretty intense. It's kind of hard to turn off, kind of hard to take our armor off. We need to always pay attention to all the rules, for fear that we might not do it right. We always need to bring our A game. Control, one thing about the legal profession, one of the beauties is that we are expected to exercise our professional judgment, and we can be in positions or situations that we're not given that judgment, we're not given that discretion, and that can be difficult. Reward, lawyers tend to come to the profession for the intrinsic rewards, and especially you as government lawyers and legal professionals, you're serving the public interest. And obviously, being a lawyer, being a legal professional is it is a job, and financial rewards are legitimate, but a lot of the time we're looking for something else. And one of the references on that source resource list is a study that was done by Patrick Krill, where they found that lawyers who felt valued for their skills, attributes, or inherent worth have better health outcomes. And so, that's sort of just being recognized for doing a good job. We of course, we love awards when we receive awards, but it's not really about that. But especially during times like COVID, when we're doing more than probably more than we ever did before, to have some recognition of that can be helpful, and we might not always get that. Community, when we talk about the lawyer's workplace, I'm not talking about the Attorney General's office specifically, or any of these other workplaces. As legal professionals, our workplace is the profession, and because unless we're working very narrowly in one place, the impact of what we do, and the people we connect with, and the different systems that we're involved in are all part of our workplace. And so those workplaces, that community can be difficult. We can have negative interactions. We have lots of interactions, no doubt, but they might not be overly positive. In fact, as I heard that government workers, you're visible in a way that lawyers and other legal professionals aren't necessarily, and what you do tends to be a little bit more public. And so having people out there who are saying negative things, they're not even people you know or who know what it is you do, to have that kind of negativity, just as an example, can be very, very difficult. And then in terms of fairness, we're talking about unfairness, whether it's explicit or implicit bias and those other things that I mentioned, but also we are sometimes working in environments where the playing field isn't necessarily even, or where we're really not able to affect the kind of change that we hope that we could affect. And that sort of part of that is reward, but it's also being in a system where there's systemic unfairness by itself. And then values, looking at not finding meaning in what it is you're doing. And when I talk about these things, it doesn't mean you're necessarily in the wrong job, or this has been going on for a long period of time. These things can happen from a change, whether it's a pandemic or a change in workload or whatever. that maybe what we came to find here in the law and was there before is just, it's hard to find, it's hard to see. And part of that might be because we are burning out. So unfairness drives burnout, as indicated by the Maslach factors, and I think we instinctively know this as well. And so it could be explicit bias, which is overt disparate treatment. And when that's happening in a workplace, whether it's directed at you or someone else, it impacts everyone. And then we'll talk a little more about implicit bias, that automatic, unintentional displays of bias that impact other people. Because in that regard, knowledge is power, awareness is power, and there are steps that you can take to address it. So, what we do has impact on so many others. And when we are in a burnout phase, we might not be as aware as we otherwise would be of both what we're thinking, doing, and acting on for others. So what is implicit bias? There are attitudes, stereotypes we don't even realize necessarily that we have. It impacts how we understand the world, what we do, decisions we make. And it's not necessarily all negative. Sometimes there are positive bias that's nonetheless impact people in negative ways. And so I bring these forward as an illustration. You might wonder what the heck, but bear with me here. So on the left is a Camaro. On the right is a Buick. And when you're on the road and you see these cars, you might have a reaction. Now you might be thinking, I don't know that I do. Well, that's the thing about implicit bias. We don't know that we do. But think a little harder. What might you think about the driver of the Camaro? And you're not in the room, so you can't necessarily tell me that. But just bring to mind, what do you think when you see that car on the road? And then what about the driver of the Buick? We'll change it up a little bit. Now we have the Camaro in pull me over red, and then the Buick is in, maybe we'll call that boring beige. What might we expect of these drivers? Maybe this elicits a little bit stronger realization. Many times people will say with the Camaro, maybe that's a midlife crisis sort of automobile, or maybe it's a rash, young person, typically male, although many times that would be a female, but we have, but those stereotypes enter into that. Maybe we think they're going to be faster, they're going to be competitor, something that maybe we feel like we need to rise to the level of. But we react based on what we perceive the impact might be on us. And so these are split-second judgments that just cause us to do things. Do you pull up at the stop sign next to the Camaro to race the Camaro? Probably not if you're if you're on a scooter. But as we think about the Buick, what do we think about the driver? Who might be driving that vehicle? What does your brain instinctively tell you about the driver? And how might you react to that? So as most of you probably know, we do have a law in Minnesota that says you can't drive in the left lane below the speed limit. Maybe what your brain tells you is that this is somebody who's going to be doing just that, somebody who's going to slow you down, perhaps, somebody who might be older, somebody who might not be able to even see over the steering wheel. There's all kinds of things that your brain tells you that you didn't even know that were there, and you had never even thought about it, but you might actually be acting on them without even realizing them. So, especially if we feel like we're going to be impacted in some way, if, this car is going to cause us to have to slow down, and, we're going to miss this light, and so we're going to be late for this meeting or whatever it is, we're making these split-second reactions all the time. So we don't necessarily know that it's happening. We might not realize we've even done anything in response to, we don't necessarily feel adrenaline kicked in when we saw the Camaro, but it did. So, maybe we, didn't realize we disliked Camaros, or we, felt threatened by them or whatever, but that's implicit bias. And, not because you harbor resentment, you don't like Camaros, or, maybe you don't like foreign cars, loud cars, etc., but because your brain told you something, you reacted to it. And obviously, the type of car somebody drives is not a big deal, but it can have an impact. What if it is something that matters and affects others, and your brain has caused you to say something or do something or react in a way that you don't even realize. So that implicit bias impacts how we treat others, and then how we think about others who we perceive might impact us in some way. So implicit bias, recognition that implicit bias is manifested towards those with mental health issues, depression, anxiety, and substance use in the profession is significant. President Brown had an initiative during her year that was called Project Bias, which is something you can find on the ABA website, which addresses bias in the criminal justice system. But from her interactions with the ABA Commission on Lawyer Assistance Program, and her awareness of how mental health disabilities are prevalent in the legal profession, she essentially called out that form of implicit bias in the profession. And I think that for us as legal professionals gives us confirmation, confirmation that this is important. It's a baseline, and it allows us to have some credibility to work from in the legal profession to say, this is something that we need to be aware of, and we need to assist our colleagues. So implicit bias can show up anywhere in the legal workplace, decisions we make every day. These are just some of many examples, but assumptions we make about maybe the client or the adversary or the judge in a matter, or some of our colleagues, for example, based on how they talk or what you think you know about them. And it can include people who have mental health issues. It affects our moral and value judgments. If we have a judge who has been appointed by somebody who maybe is in a party we don't necessarily agree with, we're going to assume that they will decide things in a particular way, or based on somebody's background, maybe they were, in law enforcement, or they were on plaintiff's side doing work. We make assumptions about how they'll react and who they are. And when we're affected by burnout, we're more likely to make those. We're not thinking as clearly, and our thinking and our judgments might be more biased in that way. And so, implicit bias in the workplace impact, who we bring into our, importantly, who we bring into our organizations, how we support them, and how we give opportunities to succeed and collaborate. And as we'll talk about in a minute, it impacts abilities for people who are suffering from burnout or other health concerns to seek the help that they need. Because these things lead to stigma. And so this stat, it's not a stat, but this finding comes from a survey that was done in 2016 by the ABA in Hazleton to do a full-scale study of lawyers on issues of depression, substance use, anxiety, and help-seeking behavior. But what it tells us, so it asked what these lawyers whether they would ask for help, and respondents indicated that they would not ask for help, and these are the reasons why. They don't want others to find out they needed help. They don't want, they have concerns about privacy or confidentiality, and it's a huge barrier. In addition, you don't want to be seen as not a team player or weak or disloyal or somehow anything other than what you learned you wanted to at least appear to be in law school, which is perfect, right? I mean, we have that standard of, we need to, we at all times we need to be the best that we can be, which is a challenge. And stigma is essentially bias, and it impacts others in a way that excludes, and we'll talk about that next. So if you feel like you don't belong, it can have a significant impact on your well-being. So generations ago, when we lived in caves or huts, or at a minimum, we lived socially with others. Not belonging in your group had a negative impact on your survival. So if you didn't belong and you were outside of the group, outside of the cave or the whatever structure was of your group, you could starve, freeze to death, be eaten by wild animals. And so having a place where you feel like you can belong, or at least not being perceived as being too different, is a threat to our survival. So when a mental health issue is perceived as a weakness, and you fear that someone, having other people know about it, that makes you want to handle it on your own. There's a much better description than I'm giving you actually in one of the articles in the material list, and it's a recent ABA article written by Lindsay Rogers Seitz, and she writes about she had a mental health condition, and it impacted her in a way that she wasn't willing to share her diagnosis or ask for accommodations. And one turning experience for her was she actually asked as an associate. She let her partners know that she needed some help. She couldn't finish the project she was on, and that because she was ill. And the response was, "Don't let it happen again." So that kind of, knowing that it's not a safe place to be able to ask for help, together with a lot of the more subtle cues that that we can pick up in an environment, can make us fear being able to get the help that we need, and just sort of pulling on our armor and saying, we can do this ourselves. So as a result of the stigma, it could impact burnout because it's one of the drivers, but it could also impact your ability to even want to stay in the profession, which is what happened with the author of that article. And so, something to think about as we go through here. What are we doing to make it okay for others around us to not be okay, to be able to get help when they need help, to express a need, to share information that will, to be able to improve each other's lives. There might be some things as we go through here that rise to the surface for you. And might there be some things that 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 there are ways that you could deal with it, but you're not getting the help that you need? What barriers or challenges might you not be dealing with for fear of what others will think? And what barriers are others experiencing that they're not getting help for because of maybe things that we're doing or are in our work environments? So what impact does stigma have? Well, it looks, when someone has a mental illness, it looks a little bit different than it's treated differently from having a physical illness. And so as we know, get well cards, for example, can be very isolating. Unlike, when we're dealing with something like cancer, we're apt to talk about courage and fighting a battle, being a warrior. We're likely to organize meal trains and send get well cards and those sorts of things. And that's it doesn't happen so much with the mental health concerns, partly because maybe people don't know what to do or what to say or how to make it okay. But, I think, again, as lawyers, we kind of have a warrior mentality where we don't want to show weakness. We don't want to let on that we're struggling. We worry, especially with something like burnout, that it's us. When the reality is that, if you're burning out, that's not you, that's your work environment. And so, and you might worry that you don't get the same, the same support as you would, if you came in to say that you had a physical illness that people are more familiar with. And maybe you don't help. Maybe somebody who has some concerns, but you don't help because you don't necessarily want to be assumed to have the same sort of issues. It's a fear. Stigma is a fear of being an outcast, and it can lead to that hopelessness and burnout. And how does stigma affect us? And I say us just use the language we use to describe mental illness, using words like crazy, nuts, using the word junkie, for example, that impacts, that impacts how others people feel about getting the help that they need. How we think about mental illnesses, not necessarily in a positive way, although I think the neurodiversity movement allows us to see how biological conditions like ADHD can actually be a superpower rather than a reason to treat people as other or act in a way that make them feel that way. So being aware of those impacts, and that we can, by our behavior, how we talk, how we think about these things, how we visualize people, how we can change that is critical. And then there's a double stigma. So, by itself, being subjected to unfairness in a work environment drives burnout. But if you think about, if you are already under a microscope, or you perceive that you're, that there's an additional effect from stigma, let's say you're coming from a historically excluded or underrepresented group, and have a mental health diagnosis, you might feel you don't get a second chance to make a mistake. You might think, as the writer of that ABA article thought, if I ask for help, I won't get additional assignments. Or if I need time away or an accommodation or flexibility even, I'll be treated negatively. I mean, we're many times, lawyers are bound by these billable hours and these other aspects of the legal profession that don't promote flexibility, and particularly don't promote flexibility and encourage people to get the help they need. And so even though others might collaborate to work on a project, to feel like you can't ask for help on a project lest you not get another project, or you be treated as as not being the great lawyer you are, can prevent you from getting, it can cause burnout, but it can also just prevent you from being the great lawyer that you are. All right, signs and symptoms of burnout. We already talked about, the elements of burnout, describe some of them, but some additional ones. Difficulty concentrating is actually part of the burnout. Having chronic imbalance, and by that I mean, what's going on at work is overwhelming all other aspects of your life. And so it's not, the idea of how much time you spend. It's, this is overwhelming your ability to enjoy the other parts of your life not related to work. Definitely impacts the relationships you have with others. Being detached means you're and not believing that you can accomplish anything. Both result in a lack of motivation. Cynicism, we have a little bit of that as lawyers anyway, but it's a increasingly cynical, increasingly negative, and then just not getting any satisfaction from what we're doing, which is significant to folks who are very accomplished. Impact that it has on the brain, it thins the frontal cortex, which naturally occurs during the aging process, but it accelerates that. And in doing so, it impacts creativity, problem solving, and working memory, which are all problematic in a world where we spend a lot of time in our brains. On our body, as I said, that release of cortisol and those other hormones into the bloodstream impact our organs, and over time can wreak havoc on our bodies. And these are the things that we see connected with burnout or accompanying burnout. Burnout can cause some of these things: fatigue, anxiety, depression, but might be at play in driving the burnout. And then sometimes using chemicals as an ineffective coping strategy. And how do we do generally? How do lawyers fare? We don't fare very well at all. Generally, we have 2 to 3 times the rate of the general population on both mental illness and alcohol misuse. But that ABA study that I referenced before, 28% of us meet the criteria for depressive disorder, 18% for anxiety, and 11.5% had considered suicide. And this is pre-pandemic statistics. And we know that they are not better, and in fact, they are worse. Alcohol use, similarly, we have problematic drinking in fairly high levels. And when I say problematic drinking, I mean hazardous, possible dependence on alcohol. So that this one demonstrates general population is 6%. Judges is the next one at 9.5%. So if you think about it, 9.5% of judges have problematic drinking. 21% of all lawyers have problematic drinking, and 32% of lawyers under 30 have problematic drinking. And so we're not doing well. And how does it impact us? On the impact on discipline, there's studies estimate that 25, a quarter or more of lawyers facing disciplinary charges have some type of addiction or mental illness. And that figure is probably low because, again, that stigma can impact our willingness to acknowledge. Sometimes lawyers would rather be looked at as not a good lawyer than as an ill lawyer, and that's something that we need to change. Ethical impact of burnout. So what we've been describing is, burnout impacts us physically. It affects our brain. We're starting to have that memory impact on our memory, impact on our judgment, and then that accompanying detachment where we're not empathetic, we can't focus on the client, and impacts our ability to be zealous advocates. And so, basic competence, under Rule 1.1, which is that skill, knowledge, thoroughness, and preparation, it can be very difficult to meet that. And then losing our zeal or our spark as lawyers, we are typically in the profession because we really want to make a difference. And so the idea that somehow we're no longer connected to that important work that we're doing, or connected to the client or the other person that they serve, is problematic for both the clients and the public, the profession, and the lawyer themselves. So good news, there are ways to head off burnout, and I'm going to talk about all 5 of these. So just the reminder, so chronic stress results in burnout because of those drivers, and your body needs some cue that you're safe from threat. And so there's those drivers. You have the stress response. The stress continues. If you're not dealing with it, it will just accumulate. And so we are chronically in active stress mode. And so What the Nagotskis say is many of us are walking around with decades of uncompleted stress response simmering in our chemistry, which is, creative and almost humorous way to say, we've got, we as lawyers are carrying that stuff around, and we've been carrying that stuff around. And we need to be able to deal with it. We need to, how do we send that information to our brain that we can release those chemicals? Well, one is to reduce the amount of sort of stressful situations you're in. And we're not going to talk a whole lot about that. Instead, we're going to talk about assuming they're stressful situations, and you're, how do you release that? How do you tell your body that you're safe? And so we'll give you an example, an unlikely example, but you go up to the North Woods for a vacation, you decide to go out on your own, you encounter a bear and her cubs, and you are, the bear turns on you and you run. You start to run because your body has gone into flight mode. You are, you know exactly how far back that bear is because of the chemicals that are rushing through your system, and you're doing your best to elude the bear. Now, somehow the bear falls off a cliff or otherwise is incapacitated, because you probably wouldn't have won that battle. And you think the bear disappearing, the stress disappears. Well, it doesn't. You need to do something else to signal to your body that you're safe, that the threat is gone, and that you're safe. And so just having that thought, oh, the bear is gone, the bear is dead, isn't enough to do it. Instead, your body needs to do some other things to be able to signal to your brain that you're safe. And so what you do is you run back to camp where all your people are, you dance around the campfire and hug, and your brain says, okay, they're safe. And those hormones, those chemicals can be released, and then you don't need to worry about that stress becoming chronic. So in our world, the stressor, the bear, is not likely to do you harm. Instead, the stress is more harmful to us than the stressor in our world. So you need to find the most efficient way to close the stress response is this. So movement. Anything that whenever you're stuck in a stress activating situation, and you can probably imagine those, whether it's just this horrible project, this horrible client, this a judge, threatening contempt, or whatever it is, that happens to you during the day. You need to go home, run if you're a runner, dance, turn your music up and dance. But for 20 to 60 minutes a day to do that movement, anything that moves your body enough to be breathing deeply for 20 minutes. 60 minutes is optimal, but this is the most efficient way to close that stress response. And the idea is that if you do this every single day, and maybe you have some days where you go home and say, yeah, I didn't have any stress that day, we'll do it anyway, because this will allow your body to clear out those harmful chemicals and allow you to make sure that you're not carrying that stress around. Now, in the moment, the problem is you go back to work the next day and there's some other stressors, right? There's always going to be some things. And you can't, in the moment, you can't really fight, flight, or freeze. You can't hit somebody. You can't just freeze up. You can't run from the courtroom when the judge is sort of bearing down on your client or whatever. But what you can do is, as soon as you have an opportunity to do so, you find a place, whether it's at your desk or just in a phone booth, if you can still find one of those, whatever it is. But you take a deep breath, tense your muscles for 20 seconds, and then shake out and exhale. That's a lesson that we sort of learn from dogs. Dogs will shake. They're actually shaking off stress or discomfort. So, all right. Other ways. Now, these also work. They're not quite as efficient as getting that 20 minutes of movement in. You already know number one, because that's what we did at the beginning, those deep, slow breaths. Having positive interactions with others is important. Being able just to have conversations with other people where you're very likely to get positive responses, and you're reassured that the world is good. Being able to laugh, having people in your life that make you laugh, or a favorite comedian or whatever it is. These are all things that allow you to signal to your brain that you're safe, because you don't do any of these things if you are under threat. Love, there's just a couple that I recommend to you. One is a 6-second kiss for your significant other. Holding that for 6 seconds causes a deeper connection, the release of positive hormones. Or a 20-second hug. Give those a try. There's some other ideas here as well, but essentially anything that you that people wouldn't do when they're under threat, allow your body to move past that threat response. One of the things that drives burnout is mismatch with values and meaning, and so either finding or reclaiming meaning as a resilience strategy can have a dramatic impact on how well you're able to manage the stress. Meaning is not something that's waiting for you at the end of the tunnel. It's the reason we go through the tunnel. And so being able to figure out what is it that drives us, what is something greater than the matter at hand, what fits with our values, what is what really moves us to do what we do, and connecting with it. And maybe it's something you've never had in your job, or more likely it's something that's been lost as a result of things that have changed. How do you build meaning? Well, your service, you work in the public interest, serving clients, serving the public, looking at things not necessarily as a list of things to do today, or a matter, or this thing, or this legislation, but really thinking about who is benefiting from our work. How can we, how can we relate to that person? How can we help them, whether if it's a client, really looking at things from their perspective, and looking at things in a positive way, which is not to say everything is all roses, but to be able to look at the bright side, to be able to say this was a challenge, but I learned something from it. We do well when we're pushed but not overwhelmed. There's some resources in that resource and source list that might be helpful in terms of finding some things that work for you. Many lawyers have found that mindfulness activities have really helped quell stress, find meaning, both of which will positively impact your relationship with burnout. But importantly, they also contribute to reducing bias, because they put you in the present state of mind where you're maybe more aware of what you are thinking, increasing your empathy, being purposeful in what you're doing. And so that mindfulness, for those who might make light of that, not only does that do a disservice to the folks who do it, but it might be something that can really impact your life and others in a positive way. By engaging in the things that we probably intuitively know, or we hear all the time, things that we should be doing, sleeping and moving and staying connecting, eating well, all of those things aren't going to cure burnout, but they're certainly going to help. They help moderate the stress, and so it doesn't just continue to build, building upward until you're burnt out. Instead, it modulates the stress. Oh, and there's the diagram. So there are other strategies, anything that allows you to connect in a way that gives you joy and optimally connect with others. Our connection with others is can actually be life-saving for us and for others. Put together a burnout action plan. We do much better when we're working towards something rather than running away from it. and so, talking to other people to reaffirm that this isn't just you, that's, you're not good enough, or it's just how you're reacting to the job or the hours or whatever. Trusted colleagues can reinforce the fact that it is not just you, and they can listen, which is important. Think about what's driving your burnout, and I give you an extra slide that you can just use to do that. Consider whether there's some options in the workplace in terms of maybe the nature of the law you're working in, or the folks that you are working with. What options might there exist in the work environment? Asking for changes, maybe some flexibility, maybe working from home, so that a lot of the negative interactions, for example, that you're dealing with might not be as prevalent. And then consider what you can do, saying no, telling people when you're at your bandwidth, and maybe thinking about ways that you can re-engage with pieces of your life that have been falling away because of the focus. And then asking for help. So LCL can help you with burnout. I mean, we're here to help with anything that causes stress or distress. Oh, sorry, I'm not gonna go to that slide yet. Let's talk one more point about connecting with other people, in addition to just helping, having somebody to talk to. We're meant to be in relationships. It's critical. The hormones that we receive just from those interactions are important and will offset some of the stress. Oxytocin, whether you're petting a dog or hugging or doing that 6-second kiss, is important, and it's significant in helping deal with bias and stigma. So being supportive of each other, supporting each other's well-being, not making light of people who are actually taking the time. I think back in the day, it used to be kind of unusual for men to take a paternity leave, because there was a stigma against it, and we've come a long way, and I'm hoping we can come a long way to really being able to not make light of our need as lawyers to be well. We need to be well to be good lawyers. We need to help ourselves to be able to help others. So so thinking about some of the things we talked about, the language you use, being aware of bias in the environment and in yourself and in others, and addressing it. So, all right. So who are we? We are Minnesota's Lawyer Assistance Program. We are here to support you, whether you're a lawyer, law student, legal professional, or a judge, or family member. We have free and confidential services. And whether it's, especially as we're talking about burnout, that person that you could talk to, that trusted colleague, can be one of our professional staff members who can listen, help, strategize, plan around, help with the plan. It could be peer support, others who have, experienced this and are there who understand, listen, and support you. We have support groups around career choices, so if you're thinking what you need to do is transition into another job or another position, or you just want to talk about those options, we have support groups and many others that are here. And sometimes engaging in well-being practices is not enough. I mean, when we're ill, we need to get the help that we need. And professional counseling is available to you on anything that causes stress or distress. So you or your family members. And here's where we are. Here's where we've been from the beginning, and our phone number is still the same after all these years. We're always just a call away, and we would love to be able to help as you start to think about how to approach burnout. So I'm assuming that there weren't any questions because nobody jumped in, but I'm going to take a look. What do we do as an organization to address the environments? So there's a Surgeon General's report. So somebody asked about what do you do in the for ourselves is what we talked about, but what about in our workplaces, in our environments? There's a Surgeon General report on mental health in the workplace. Actually, it's a Surgeon General's framework on workplace mental health and well-being. Is a good place to start. It's on the second page of that sources and resources. And it's something that is getting the attention of not just the Surgeon General, but others, because it really is it's a workplace obligation. And I think what the Surgeon General says is we should be able to have workplaces that truly support our well-being. And any other questions? I think since we're over time, I don't think we're able to have a communication, but you can call us 646-5590. You can always email help@mnlcl.org, which goes right to Joan Biegelhausen, our executive director. And so I'd love to answer any questions that you have. Feel free to call me or email me, jrush@mnlcl.org or 651-646-5590. Thanks for being here, and let us know how we can help.